Warning: the following contains explicit language and subject matter that may not be suitable for younger listeners, church folk, and people who enjoy kale smoothies.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to A Pod Amongst Men. I'm your host, Steve B., and these are coffee break conversations for the 21st century. So, we're back. I don't have anything new as far as the podcast goes to tell you about. I will tell you about my guests, plural, today. Today I have Anwar Ahmed and Kyle Rushton, two Canadian gentlemen. They're the hosts of the Modern Masculinity podcast. And we came here to talk about all things related to manhood and masculinity. Those guys are very deep thinkers about, the ideas behind what modern masculinity, obviously, given the name. But, they were generous at the time. They came on to chat with me for a while. I've really enjoyed it. Smart dudes. And they have some very interesting and good ideas, I think. So hopefully you guys get something out of it. And before I ruin the whole thing by talking too much, here's my conversation with Anwar and Kyle.
Let's go. I got to get my seatbelt on. All right, let's go. We buckled in. We buckled in.
Let's go.
I guess I'll go first and let the coffee resonate with Kyle a little bit. Let the coffee let the coffee like get into his bloodstream. I think, just high level introduction. I think for me, what I feel like what my life consists of right now is, I even have it in my Instagram bio, is that like I'm a recruiter by the day and I'm a podcaster at night.
Recruiter how? Not like a military recruiter, but like.
No, just business recruiter. Yeah. Like no military. No, I recruit people for businesses. So, helping them find unique talent that, they might be able to find on their own. A pure headhunter ultimately. And then at nighttime, I think that like podcasting is like my ultra personality, like those are the two things. One thing that makes me money, one thing that helps me be creative. So that's who I am. In the pandemic, I've really just been those two people back and forth. But, above and beyond that, a little bit more deeper than that, I'm a first generation Canadian, and that's really where my roots and my foundation, derive from. A lot of the complications and a lot of the, the blessings, they come from that identity, being a first generation Canadian and having to navigate this world where, you have parents that have never really grown up here, but they have all these values and all these, moral compasses that they use to get through what they went through. And then being the first person to have to navigate this world, and always having your internal household and your external, friends and schools and stuff being completely different. You know what I mean? And I think that is the trampoline in which, the trajectory of who I am as a person kind of stemmed from. In addition to kind of that, fan, like in terms of kind of what I like I'm a big sports guy. I think that there's a lot of comparisons to life and sport, and that's kind of been my, like, if you want to say like, life is a destination, I think that's been my map for a long time. I use sports to kind of navigate the, the world, the questions, the answers, more specifically basketball. That's been kind of, my game. I'm a big
Sorry about your Lakers.
I was gonna say I don't want to talk about it, but
I was say, should you be like a Raptors fan?
I think every Canadian is a Raptor fan. Like I think naturally that's just a thing. We're all Raptors fans, but I learned the game and I fell in love with the game through Kobe Bryant. You know what I mean? Okay. So I'm a Laker fan. That's who I am. But we're not talking about that right now. Congratulations, Devin Booker, but we don't want to talk about it. And then. I think like what I love is, building relationships and connecting, like what we're doing here. Like this has been my whole life, being able to connect and, learn about life through other people's story. I think that the perspective that you gain by building relationships with other people and, being able to find similarities and differences, it's helped me kind of navigate. And I used that as a crutch when I was really young. And it's something that I've just always continued to do. And I enjoy, I love doing is, building relationships, exchanging stories. That gives me energy, that gives me perspective, and it helps understanding the next day easier for me. And so I think anytime that I've, continue to engage in things like this, learning about people, it's always helped me in some capacity. You know what I mean? And, my bigger mission is, being able to kind of take all of those learnings and help influence the younger generation, and I think that that's kind of the full circle of, a journey for me is, having those challenges at a young age, being able to navigate all those challenges, continuously learning people, getting to understand people's story and their perspective, and then ultimately sharing it back to the younger generations that they maybe have an easier path than I did, in self-understanding and esteem and things like that. So I think that's kind of the full circle of, where I was, what I'm doing now, and what I want to do in the future. And I think that kind of summarizes me up.
Okay. Well, just so you know, this is already the most sports talk we've ever had on this podcast, so I want to congratulate you for that.
Really?
Yeah, this is much more on the nerd side. I'm not really like a sports guy. I like boxing, but and I was a Devils fan when I was in grade school. But aside from that, it's not really never been my thing. So congratulations! This is an A Pod Amongst Men first.
Here we go. Let's go. I did not think I would get that ribbon, but I'll take it.
Well, what we could do is we could actually, as you guys talk about it, we could kind of test how much knowledge I've gleaned just from hearing other real men talk about this stuff where I work.
You're more on the animated and stuff like that, right? Like I see a lot of your
I'm into anime like peripherally. Like my son really likes it, so I try to, partake in the things he likes to do as much as I can stand while keeping my sanity. But I like stuff like that when I was young. I like comics. I like Marvel. I'm more of a movie person myself. I like films, and I'm not like a snob about it. So I like the real artsy, like films, and then I also am in love with Marvel movies. So I think you can enjoy the best of both worlds and not have to kind of put the other thing down.
Are you excited for Loki this week?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm always trying to temper my expectations because I don't want to get all excited and have it be terrible. So far,
said like a true fan.
Yeah, well, Disney's been good. Marvel's been good about making stuff. After WandaVision, I didn't think that was going to be good, and it was amazing.
It was so good.
Yeah. Yeah, before I don't want to get too lost in the weeds with all that stuff, because then you'll just lose me for a half an hour. So, Kyle, you want to go next?
So my name is Kyle Rushton. Most people know me by Coach Kyle. And on the podcast, I go by CK, and I am a personal life coach. I support people in integrating mind, body, and soul connection in order to consciously create their reality, which essentially to me means not living through the old conditioned patterns that were dealt with or were given to us when we were younger in our upbringing, and as well as the societal standards, just choosing to live how we want to live, not based on somebody else's idea of who we should be. So that's my biggest goal, and that's my biggest vision. That's what I'm most inclined with. But I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, so I'm a Canadian and have been my entire life. I moved to Toronto a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, things shifted. So I decided to move back to Calgary, which is where I currently am now and where I probably will be for at least probably the next year to 2 years. I might likely will be back in Toronto, but we'll see how the next little bit goes. I love Toronto. Toronto is such a beautiful city. And I grew up playing sports. So soccer is my number one sport. It has and always will be. I'll watch it at any time of the day, 6 a.m., 9 p.m., doesn't matter. I'm watching it. But I'll watch any sport. I love any kind of sport. I'll watch pool. I'll watch, what's another one that most people don't watch? I'll watch table tennis. I'll watch anything. You put it on the TV and I promise you I'll be watching. It's just maybe the competitive nature of it all. I think a lot of it is just the skill too. Watching people play is such a beautiful thing because it's so intricate in so many ways. And the sports that most people don't watch, I find are the ones that are most intricate, so require a little bit more attention and focus, and it's just very, very fascinating. So anyways, soccer was my big one. And then I played basketball for a bit, and then I kind of stopped. I played a bit of university soccer as well. So I played at a little bit of a higher level, which was a great experience. And now my life has completely shifted away from all of those spaces and the competitive nature. I work on my own. I'm an entrepreneur. And I also am a part of a youth program for young men, age 13 to 21. And it is supporting them in becoming incredible men and basically helping diminish or hopefully rid of violence against women. So it's run by a place called Women's of Habitat of Etobicoke, which is in Toronto. And they support and house women who are experiencing violence from men. And so their thought was, well, we're reacting to the problem, but we're not proactively helping the problem. And so they decided to create this program. I was fortunate enough to be reached out to help co-facilitate this. So I spend a lot of my time doing that with the young boys, which has been so fulfilling. And then obviously we have the Modern Masculinity podcast, which is a huge component of our lives. And that's me.
All right. So obviously the first thing I want to ask you regarding everything is, how do you guys get into this space, like this area of topics, of subject matter? How do you, what motivates you to create Modern Masculinity? I want to hear the genesis of how this comes about.
I can take this one. So
right.
Anwar and I became friends in Toronto through a mutual friend of ours. And it was very much divine timing. I think that a lot of it wouldn't have happened if I, as weird as this sounds, if I wasn't in such a bad position myself. I was in a pretty poor position with myself, and it caused a lot of rift with this specific friend. And so he decided to make some different decisions that I didn't think a lot of us saw coming. And that's not to say that, he didn't want to live with Anwar, but it was a great opening for him to experience somebody new. So they started to live together, and then Anwar and I became friends. And through that process, we just really acknowledged that we have this profound ability to have conversations together. We work well off of each other. We seem to just be able to hold longer conversations. They're usually deeper, and we challenge each other. And that's something that Anwar caught before I did. And that was made true by his reach out one day out of absolutely nowhere. And he said, "Hey, listen, I've had this idea. I've been wanting to do a podcast for a while. We had really good conversation. Just thought I'd plant the seed. No worries, no rush. I just thought I'd say hi. And this is what my thoughts are." And sure enough, on my end, I had been wanting to start a podcast for a while, but an actual true podcast. I had one that was called Feel the Rush, which was a work off of my last name, but it only lasted 2 episodes. I hated every second of it. But
that's the hardest part, is coming up with the name. It really is. I've been talking with my wife recently about maybe starting like a second one, so it'd be like the two of us, and coming up with a name it's hard. And obviously you come up with a good one, like, oh, this is gonna hit, and then you look and there's like 16 of the same name out there.
Yeah.
God damn it! Who would have thought that Café con Leche was already taken?
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge we face as well. So yeah, anyways, we had a meet up at coffee, and we had a conversation about where we thought the podcast could go and where we wanted it to be. And the whole premise was personal development. That's where we were going. That's what we wanted, because we both value that space a lot. And it was something we were highly into. And so we had an incredible meeting, and all of a sudden, next thing we knew, we had weekly meetings set out, and we were talking every single week. We had 3 to 4 hour meetings every single week, which turned into Saturdays and Sundays. And we were on. We were creating, we were moving. It was incredible. And we had so many great ideas. We faced the same challenges that you just did with the name and balancing what that looks like. I can't even really remember what some of the first names were off the top of my head, but I think they had to do with power or personal power or something along those lines. Standing tall. Yeah. And then one day I had a thought, and I had been in the men's space at that point for probably 6 months or so. Well, a little less, maybe 5 or 6 months. And I had just started to develop myself as a man, and I started to support other men in the same context. And I got to thinking, there's so many personal development podcasts out there, and so many incredible ones too, like Jay Shetty and Tony Robbins and Lewis Howes, and just there's a multitude of them. And I got to thinking, but is there a multitude of men's podcasts? Because I don't really feel that way. I don't really know where they all are. And maybe I'm just missing them. I don't know. So I brought the conversation to Anwar and said, listen, I think this is great. What if we transition this into a men's podcast and supporting men, niche it down a little bit, make it a little bit more specific? And we stewed on it for a bit and thought about it and came back the next week and both agreed that the world needs this more. So that was where this entire modern masculinity space really, really was born from.
It's interesting because I had a similar thought, like it doesn't seem like there's a lot of stuff for just men out there, at least in a healthy way, because there's obviously the dumb stuff out there for men, like the Spike TV version of what people think men want to hear. But what I found, and tell me if you guys have had a similar experience, is that there is a very vast array of opinions and ideas about the topic of what it means to be a man and masculinity and general manhood, etc. And I found that a lot of times a lot of these ideas really clash, and some people, I choose to believe that they're really trying to help and trying to help men, but I feel like there's a lot of bad ideas out there, and you know, I want to combat that. I don't want to be combative about it. You know what I mean? Like, I just want to put better ideas out there. Like, if you guys found that there's a lot of stuff out there in the same area that you really strongly, vehemently disagree with.
I don't know if Anwar has, but I know I'm pretty deep into this space, and it's so interesting to listen to some of them because they are quite fascinating, and some of them are a little more tough. I think Anwar actually has a good example. I don't know if he remembers, but he was listening to a podcast that wasn't necessarily specifically for men, but I was talking about men. And what's fascinating to me is it's a challenging space. Even if you read the men's books that are created, they're all contradicting. Mm-hmm. And I think it really has to do with this idea that men love to be right. And men have a very ego-driven focus. They're very focused on that. And so when you get into the space, they're speaking as if that's the only answer. Mm-hmm. And if you compare that to the women's books and the women's space, it's not like that. It's very open, and it's very, oh, I like that idea, or that's a good idea, we could try that. And the men is like, no, that's wrong. And, oh, that's stupid. And, oh, why are you saying that? And it's so, like you said, you don't want to be combative, but at the same time, like, not a lot of them are really coming together. Yeah. They're very much like, this is my path and you can go that way because I don't know what you're doing. So I definitely noticed that personally.
Yeah, I think that, like, just even the philosophy and the idea, right? Like, we had this conversation, me and Kyle, in our previous podcast, where we talk about the willingness to want to learn, right? Mm-hmm. Like, when you sit in a position, whatever the hierarchy is, or the patriarchy that we kind of came through and all of that kind of stuff, when men haven't had to bear the understanding of not having the right to vote, or not having things and having to fight to get stuff, mm-hmm. then you kind of sit in a position where you need to actually actively want to learn and want to be open and want to understand. And needs are easier to chase than wants, right? Like, when you need something, you got to do it. Right? Definitely, like, it's definitely. Like, if there's no roof over your head, there's no food, when you need something, when you don't have a voice, when you can't vote and you want to vote, you have to do something about it, right? You gotta insert energy behind it. Wants are things that are harder to do because you got to actively own your ego, own the understanding that you want something better for someone else, and you're going to want to do it. And I think that a lot of, sometimes the men's stuff is to kind of protect what has been created and not open it up to what we want, what we want the world to look like. And I think it's easier to be in, like, let's say a female's position or a minority's position and know what battle you're fighting than it is to address a fight that isn't there. And you're like, I'll fight for something. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's
a lot of guys seem like they're very defensive, like, very reactively.
For sure. Very reactive. And let's give some men a little bit of credit. Mm-hmm. There has been a little feeling where we've been attacked,
for sure.
And attacked in a way that, like, the walls go up, and instead of, like, you open up a conversation, a lot of the work that me and Kyle did, a lot of times we talk about, we go, hey, if this is where people are and this is where they're hearing it from, can we add a middle layer where it filters through and there's a little bit more, it hits the ear, it hits the sonic ear a bit differently, and it actually comes from a man too. Mm-hmm. Men talking to men, be like, hey, listen, I know that sounds like it's attacking, but it's not. It's actually this. Like, how can we act as a filter? That's something that me and Kyle are consciously active about, is like, how can we act as a filter to help influence and shape perspective and shift thought processes from being men, you know what I mean? And how do we help support some of these conversations that are happening? And that's a big part of, what we do is that filter. Exactly.
That is one of the reasons that why I kind of zeroed in on you guys when I liked what I saw, is because that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm trying to do. It's, you can't just, I get it that, there's definitely, obviously, like you said, men feel attacked to a certain extent, and there's varying degrees of justification to that. But I feel like the people that are trying to tell men, like, hey, you need to be better, you can't be doing this stuff anymore, we need to evolve, they need to understand, like, you have to meet people where they are. You can't just shout down at people and say, you're terrible, you did this. And I'm only doing what I was taught. And then, obviously, like you said, the walls go up. So this whole idea of our respective podcasts is to meet men where they are, is to be that conveyor of the information. Like, hey, we're guys too. We know how to talk to each other. Like the way you're doing it is obviously counterproductive to a certain extent. So let us be kind of like, let us translate it. You know what I mean? And that's 100%. One of the things that I like is, for me, obviously I have the serious stuff. I try to do it with a bit more of like a silly aspect and kind of
humor.
Fun. Just to help guys let the guard down a little bit, The humor, if it's like the medicine, the pill you have to give your dog, and you wrap it in cheese or coat it in peanut butter or something. You have to hide it in there.
Exactly.
They get it.
100%.
So I mean, I hate to compare us to dogs. It's a little hacky, but hey yo. But that right there is that I think that is a very, very important common ground that we share right now between our two shows.
For sure. And that's a big challenge, right? Like, I think that is a huge challenge, but it's a challenge in life, right? Like, it's being able to, like, as a recruiter, I see this a lot in, very technical jobs and stuff like that. Like, the people that companies want to hire are the people who understand the technology, but can speak it in layman's terms. You know what I mean? Like, who can, and I think life is a big challenge of that, is like, how do you take something complicated? How do you take problems? How do you take challenges, put it into layman's terms, and make it actionable so someone can execute on what you just said? Because I have no idea, and even sometimes when we get into these bigger conversations, another thing me and Kyle focus on is like, how can we not just be a therapy session and be a actionable place where you give people the tools to overcome some of these, conditionings that they've been taught, right? Like, it's one thing to tell someone, hey man, I know you've been told, not to cry or to toughen up and to be a man. It's one thing to say to someone, yeah, be vulnerable. It's one thing to like show someone how to be vulnerable, teach them the ways to get involved in vulnerability, like applying tools and ways in which you can actually like embody some of the skills, needed to overcome some of that conditioning. And so I think the first layer what you notice is like sometimes a lot of these men's podcasts, even when we go and listen to other men's podcasts to kind of just do market research, you'll hear it. It's like the first time a man's been able to just like talk, right? There's like no progression. It's just like, I'm just like laying it out because I've never laid it out before. Yeah. And that is huge therapeutically, right? But it's like, hopefully in 2-3 years, we're out of this, like, just like word vomiting our emotions and finally letting it out. And we're like, how do we pick this all up now and execute on it? How do we, because all it does is if now we're just creating places where we dump, well, then that all that tells me is that you're going to leave, you're going to bottle it up until the next time you want to dump. And for every month that it's held in, you're not actually progressing as an individual. You're just like, now you've created an outlet where you're like, oh, I can go on this podcast and drop all my emotions for the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's just venting.
We're just venting, right? And, venting serves a massive purpose, but I think me and Kyle want to see beyond that and like create a platform where, venting is there, but then what can we do in terms of like making people be able to like hold less and be more?
Well, the venting is great. You're getting it all out, but if you're not examining all that stuff, how you got to that point in the first place, and you're really not growing, it becomes a Band-Aid. We're not addressing the root cause. We're just addressing the symptoms. So I mean, I guess there's obviously right now it's super easy to make a podcast, and anybody, and to a certain extent everybody is doing it, but you could kind of tell when some people just needed it. They were using it as like a hobby, and like you said, it's just this word vomit. There's no structure. There's no like examination. It's just, hey, this is what's going on in my head, and like I like the idea of being able to kind of segment some of that stuff and kind of take it bit by bit by bit. And even, for me, like the venting part is great, but it's not just getting it out. It's being relatable to your audience and to other men. And sometimes like sharing your own stories, even your own pain, just somebody else listening and kind of identifying with it and relating to it is a huge help in itself. And just the feeling like you're not alone, maybe it helps, alleviate feelings of isolation even. Just knowing that there's other people out there experiencing the same thing that you are can go a long, long way. And that was another thing that I try to do on here is just tell our stories, So, I mean, but that being said, do you guys have specific like experiences or stories that kind of pushed you into this area? Because I know for me, in the time, like maybe the first 3-4 months of starting my show, I feel like I learned so much and my ideas evolved about, what this was even supposed to be, and then reevaluating my own ideas and positions on things. Did you guys go through that? Any kind of like, were you challenged with anything right? Early on.
Yeah, I think for me, walking into this space, I went through a bit of a challenging time at the beginning of 2020, where a breakup took what felt like my sanity. And so for me in that moment, it was very much the beginning of the development I felt of what it meant to be a man. And so for basically the entirety of 2020, I was reflecting on my experiences as a man. And, was there even a moment where I became a man? And what was my upbringing like with the fatherhood that I had? And what were the men doing that were surrounding me? And I just did all of the reflection that I could. And then I started to look at myself and see, was I an adult or was I an adolescent? Where was I at in my own psyche, my own actions, my own behaviors, just to decipher it, not to say that I wasn't a man yet. It just never felt like I made the decision, or it never felt like someone supported me in that. And so when I walked into this space with Anwar, I think that, not to discredit him because he's done so much incredible work, but I walked in with a different space because I had already begun that journey intensely. And I went through the education process and I started to research and read books and get into the archetypes and whatnot. And so I walked in with a lot more reflection time. So I think for myself, I was at a bit of a leg up with that. And so I think that's why the idea originally came from me. But when Anwar stepped into this space, I think that he and his answers challenged me more than my own learnings did. And the way that he spoke on his past experiences and his perspectives on how it went through his life. And that's why we mentioned at the beginning, we just have great conversation because it doesn't seem like it's work to challenge each other or to move each other in a different space. It's just what happens as we talk to each other. And so when it started to really uncover things, it was really eye-opening for me about my experiences growing up and what my fathers were like and how he saw his father experience and how that could have helped me or will help me see my experience more clearly. And I guess, specific examples would be, I grew up with rageful experiences. There was a lot of lack of emotional intelligence. There was that struggle in that space. So I was always confused as to why that was. So, when we talk about the idea of men these days and who taught them how to be a man, it's rarely the father these days. It's likely the mother as best as she could. And so that was my experience as well. Right. And so that's kind of some of the bigger motivations for me as to how we got into this space is how do I support men in deciphering and understanding why they do what they do from the perspective and the lens of their upbringing, because I find that a lot of, and even for me, my entire growing up, I wasn't willing to look at that space. I thought I moved past it. I thought I was breaking the cycle. I thought I was doing all of the things, but it was more of like a beautiful thought than it was an intentional action. And it's sure enough, I would get triggered by the most outlandish things, thinking that, oh, well, it's just because of this or what have you. And that's what I mentioned by it's a beautiful thought, because it requires work. And one of the statements I live by is self-awareness only leads two ways. It leads to success or it leads to suffering. So when you become aware of it, it's your choices of which direction, but you can't just sit in self-awareness. So for me, the experiences really started to blossom as him and I talked. So I think that answered your question. I'm not quite sure if that nailed an actual experience.
No, definitely.
There's definitely a lot of motivations into this space. And I also have a predominantly female family system. I have a mom and three sisters, younger sisters. And so for me, supporting the development of men so that way they can walk into this world with conscious men to be with, and they don't have to go through the same experiences that we all kind of have been, is another huge motivator for me as well.
What about you, Anwar?
Yeah, I mean, Kyle kind of laid it out there on a silver platter, as he always does, in terms of kind of, the men's space. And he said it well, right? Like Kyle was a lot more polished than I was in terms of kind of the men's space, like kind of coming into it. And a lot from like a literature perspective. I think the bounce back and forth that we had is I felt like I was doing a lot of the learning about the men's space in real life. And I just hadn't put words to it. Like I've been watching behaviors, patterns. I grew up, I knew what I was struggling with. I kind of knew everything, but not from a literature perspective at all, and combining with Kyle, what had happened was he would come with like this understanding, this research, and I would just be like leveraging that research and like bring it into an experience, leveraging the research, bring it to an experience. And the back and forth there became very powerful because it was two completely different avenues. And I learned most things in life through like experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't really reach for literature as a way to like learn and navigate through life. Typically life brings me curiosity and then I go the other way. I'm so curious that I go and learn about what I want to learn about.
Mm-hmm.
I would never just pick up a book, read it just, you know, for gags. Like it's not really been my way of learning. My way of learning has been kind of experiencing things and being curious, and then letting that kind of lead my curiosity. And so Kyle really brought that literature into my space and kind of into, you know, what I was already doing. But for me, I knew deep down inside that I was struggling with some sort of like masculine identity, right? Because I just knew that there was, like for me, it was life, you know, self-mastery and self-development. It was what I was after. That is what I was seeking literature in, you know? So I was trying to get better at figuring out myself and trying to figure out like, you know, how can I be the best version of myself? And in my childhood, I spent a lot of time like being whatever the external world wanted me to be, right? And I always trying to fit into this group. I moved a lot, you know? So it was like, every time I got to a new place, it was like, leave who you are at the door, figure out how to navigate this world with what they want you to be. And you do that enough times with 10 different groups. Well, who you are is like 14 blocks back. You know what I mean? And so my journey back to that individuality, my journey back to that authentic version of myself, I had to start finding how can, first thought is, how do I get back to that? How do I get back to who I am? And you learn, okay, self-discovery. Then you learn, okay, self-mastery. And then a big component is I'm like, God damn it, I'm a man. Like, I got to figure out this man stuff too. Like, I think it's like the self-mastery and self-discovery is awesome in a general perspective and an umbrella, right? When you can like, you know, hear something that would be good for both men and women, you know, it's great. Like, that's great advice. That's great deep insight. But then it's one thing to also understand like, oh, you as a man are going to see this differently too. And this is going to resonate with you. So I think it's just deepened my understanding for that, you know, that seek of trying to find who I am authentically. And it's a journey that I think we're going to be on for a long time. I just think a very integral part of that journey is understanding who I am as a man, you know, understanding who I am as a person, and then understanding who I am as a human, and understanding all three of those different facets. You know, I am a man, I am a human, and I'm a person, right? Like, how do they all work? And how do they all work together? And that's kind of been my path. And Kyle's really helped me, you know, challenge myself in that. Like, I remember we were having a brainstorming session, like, you know, one Saturday, and I was just like, dude, it's crazy. We sit here every single week and we talk about things that are like way beyond the average. Like, what we're sitting here thinking about, like so many different problems. And I'm just like, we do this every week. Like, there's people who haven't done that like once, you know what I mean? Every week we are constantly at the drawing board. Like, what are you feeling? Why are you feeling that way? This topic. Where are you holding things? Where you need to let go of things? And all from the lens of being a man. And I think I've learned about my manhood during this process more than I've ever learned before, you know? And so I think that it's something that's really going to be able to serve me, you know, moving forward. And I hope to, as we learn, you know, podcasting is one of those games where we're not experts, right? Like, we're not clinically trained. We're just human beings who are learning. And instead of learning in the dark, we're like, hey, we'll learn in public and we'll take the repercussions that come with learning in public, because we think that like the real value is showing you how we built this, not it's built, right? Like, I think when you see Apple and it's the finished product, you're like, that's really cool, but how did they do that?
Yeah, you come into it from a place of humility. You know, it's like, listen, I'm no better than anyone else. I'm learning just like you. So why don't you take the journey with me instead of me just standing up on my high horse and, you know, preaching down to everyone else and, you know, being all self-righteous. And I think that right there is one of the things that makes it more relatable. It's just like, hey, let's do it together, you know? And that's hopefully enough people, you know, take notice and are receptive enough to see, you know, hey, listen, we don't know everything, but we know a couple things. Maybe you could do something with it. I don't know. That's what I like. One of the things you guys, I'm kind of take a bit from each of you, but like Kyle mentioned, you know, going through a breakup was a big challenge, and Anwar mentioned like finding his identity, having to adjust from place to place. And one of the things that I found was that going through breakups and any kind of emotionally traumatic events, those are the times that we learn the most about ourselves, you know, dealing with pain and suffering even. And we examine things, especially with a breakup specifically. You say, oh, what did I do wrong that contributed to this? You know, what's wrong with me personally? And at least if you're actually trying to do work on yourself, you do those things. Some guys are just like, fuck her, you know, but anybody who's coming to it from a good place is like, all right, what can I do to avoid this happening again? And it sucks, but those are the times when there's the most potential for growth. So, I don't like to shy away from talking about those things. I recognize that it's difficult for a lot of people, kind of reliving that pain. But I really, I tell people, this is the time when you can really make the changes. You can really do something that matters and, become a better version of yourself, But I think a lot of people, a lot of guys especially, don't look at it as becoming a better version of yourself. Like they look at it with the blinders on, where it's like, oh, you want me to change? You want me to be some, as some simp or some beta male kind of thing. Like, no. We want to make you the most effective version of yourself. Be you, but be the full spectrum of you. Everything that encompasses. Like for me, that was always the big thing. Is I don't think guys need to change who they are. I think they need to be the best version. They need to open up all the different potential avenues of their own personality and their own potential. I talked to the guests about this in the past, where it's like, you don't have to not be what we consider a man, but we have to be more. You can't not have the sensitive side, essentially. So, but I'm going on a tangent now. But those challenging times, those challenges and struggles we go through, those are the best times to learn and grow. Do you guys agree with that?
100%. And what's coming up for me, and what I like what you're saying is, you mentioned just at the end there, it's not about being, I think you said being a great man or something along those lines. It's something that, and Anwar and I often speak about and share together, is that our goal with the podcast is, yes, it's a men's podcast and we're supporting men specifically. However, our end goal, our larger, our widened goal would be to just become great humans. Right. It's beautiful to focus on being a great man, and that's fantastic. But there are human components that we're missing. There are human components that we're neglecting in the man space, thinking that we need to be more of whatever a man is supposed to be. And, I literally do air quotes because no one actually has the answer to that. But we do our best. That's why the contradicting information comes through, right? Of this book and that podcast, and, who knows, because we haven't known the challenges that we've always been in a space where, at some point, someone made a decision that this was a man. And from there, that's what we've run with for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's tough to navigate and battle because we're still working through that understanding. And so I definitely like what you said there, is that there's a lot of opportunity for there in those spaces to not always necessarily focus on being better at being a great man, which I think is still a vital part of the process. But it's just about, where am I not being human enough? Where am I not being what I was put here to do was just to be a human. Sure. And then once I found the human side of me, then I can maybe step into, okay, well now, what does masculinity look like? What does the masculine energy look like? And how can I start to embody that? Because that's really where a lot of the influences come through is, it's not really being a great man. It's being great at being a man and what that looks like. So I think it's a beautiful share. And yeah, the breakup for me obviously taught me a lot. I think that what you mentioned there, some men don't do it. And I totally understand why, because I didn't want to do it. There's a level of there's a level of radical responsibility you need to take in order to get into that space. And like Anwar was saying at the beginning of this podcast, a lot of times we're not willing to learn. We're not willing to change. And it's not because we don't want to, it's because we're men, because we've never been said you have to change, because the ways that we've always operated have just worked. So there's been no pressure to be like, you need to change and you need to do this differently, because we still get what we want without changing. So why would we feel the need to, based on the patriarchy? Why would we bother? So in those moments, it really does take another level of saying, hold on a second, maybe it was all wrong. Maybe I am doing it wrong or did do it wrong. And then trying to learn from that. But it is hard. It definitely is hard. And it's not fun by any means, but it's worth it. 100% worth it.
That's the thing too, is that now the society in general, at large, is changing so much that we have to examine these old ways. Like, right. Hey, look, this is not working anymore. Look at all the collateral damage you're just leaving in your path from you just going through like a blockhead. It's like, oh, this is how it's gonna be. Square peg, round hole, doesn't matter. Boom, in. Like we have to look. It's like, okay, do you need to change? Well, how do you define need? Like, what about, do you love these people in your life, your family, your friends? Like, look at what you're doing to them. Like, they may be too afraid to tell you how you're affecting them, but clearly this is having a negative effect on everybody around you. You are the problem, and I mean, in some cases, not all cases. So, but it's like your behavior needs to change. Like it needs to, because if you actually care about people, like you say, you need to reevaluate how you're affecting them. I think that's the trick, is trying to figure out how to convey those incentives to guys. It's like, you're 100% right, though. Traditionally, we've just been able to do whatever we want and things just work out, regardless of how it affects everyone else around us. So how do we convey, like, hey, it's time, it's time to evolve or die, So, I mean, with this, like you said, there's a lot of people resistant to changing, resistant to growing. Like, have you noticed any pushback, when having conversations with other men? What's the resistance? Where are these, these head-butting points for you guys?
Well, I'll start, but I know Anwar has a good experience. Anwar, I'll just drop the word sensitive so you know where I'm going in my head with that. But we just had one. We just had probably our first polarizing conversation where we started to talk about gender roles and the idea of gender. And we know that that's evolving. We know that's going through a massive evolution right now. And so we just had the conversation. And like you just said, there are components of life that we're neglecting, and going back to the human experience. Are you being a respectful human? Right? That's not a man or a woman trait or whatever gender trait.
It's not a gendered thing. It's just human.
Exactly. And so that's where we hope, again, with the podcast, to get back to those normal, basic concepts of respect. And so we just had a conversation that was actually quite unexpected. And we started to talk about the idea of pronouns and the concept of pronouns. And so that was, I think, episode 21. And what we talked about in that space was just simply opening up our understanding of how we've walked through the idea of pronouns and what they've meant to us, and why I didn't feel, or why I felt resistance to putting it up on my profile, and where that came from, and Anwar's experience with not seeing he, him on resumes in the recruiter space, always seeing they, them, and she, her, and not seeing the he, him, because men don't feel the need to do that. And what we were trying to open the conversation up to was just, you don't have to, but just know why you don't want to. Let's just have that conversation about why there's so much resistance to that. And I think, unbeknownst to us, we didn't expect the comment backlash we received from the clip we shared on our Instagram, but that was pretty large. And people were, specifically men, were saying, this is stupid. Why would we do this? What does this have to do with patriarchy? Some guy said, shut the fuck up. Why do you need 4 pronouns? Just like, there was so much combativeness. And we did not see that coming. And I think that's, for me, the first experience of like, whoa, okay. Like, we're in it now.
We hit something here.
We're in it now. And this is where and like Anwar said beautifully in one of our text messages, this is where we not neglect the conversations, but make sure that we don't come from a totalitarian space, a hierarchical space where we're saying you need to do this, because we don't speak in absolutes on our podcast, but just continuing the way we did do that podcast. Because let's be honest, the people who were commenting didn't listen to the episode. We did do a great job of wrapping it around and having the conversation, but men aren't looking for that. We posted that clip specifically to push buttons a little bit, to have the conversation that was needed, but that's all they watched. So instead of wrapping it around and hearing the before story and the after story, it was just the clip, and that was where the reaction came through, not the response. Just got
the hot take.
Exactly. So it's been very fast, and that's my big personal experience. Anwar, you have I think an experience with a friend, right, that asked something about the podcast?
Yeah. There's I think that being in this space too, there's people that want to kind of, when you're asking men to, and we're doing it, right? Every day we try to be as vulnerable. We try to be open. We try to do things that are not traditionally, what's common, right? And when you do those things, you're going to get, comments, and I remember one of my good friends, he's about to be a dad really soon. He's coming up really soon here. And we're talking about, and it was a backhanded compliment. He kind of was just like, hey, when my son is born, I'm going to send him to you for sensitivity and emotional training. No, like as if, you know, me showing up on this podcast
subtle
and
jab.
It's one of those things. That's the guy he is, right? Like he's kind of a little bit like, your podcast where it's humor but he actually knows that he values that. That's just his way of saying, hey man, I watch what you do and I'm into it. But I know that that's how it's being received. Right. And, it's our egos, right? Me and Kyle's egos are gonna like if you hear that, if you're a guy, right? Like you have to be comfortable in your own skin, right? I could go the other way when I hear that. No, like I'm a man, send your son to me for like, tough stuff, you know what I mean? And like you can get really defensive really easily if you're not comfortable with who you are, right? And so
it happens a lot.
And so it's like even the guys that are doing the work, even the guys that are, they're here for the conversation, they're listening to the conversation, where I try to deploy as much like empathy and patience to the process is just understanding the simple fact that if you've been told your whole life, hey, listen, don't cry, man up, all these things, right? And you quietly behind closed doors say, you know what, I don't like that. I'm going to start like learning about how to like fix that and learn the power of like expressing and releasing those emotions and the benefits of like being able to be, a more expressed human being and not suppressed human being. It's still going to take you some time to learn how to cry in public though. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're not just gonna, that transition doesn't happen overnight. Right. So I try to look at those jabs as we're creating the ripple effect that's happening. Right. And so you gotta have a different type of like thought process, because how you're sending it out is not going to be how you come back. And my rock in this process is Kyle. Right. So I got to stay true to the process. I got to stay true to what we've decided we were going to do, because if you don't deploy delayed gratification in the men's space, you're going to quit real quick.
Yeah.
Right. Because there is no gratification right away. That ripple effect is happening. You got to really believe that, you're changing minds 1% at a time. And if you lose sight of that, you'll leave this space pretty quickly. And I think that for us, it's been, we have each other to like understand like, hey, we're doing good work. Keep doing it, because it's not instant gratification in this space at all. You're working through really, 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 really deep conditioned thought processes and ideas. And sometimes I always say to Kyle too, it's like, we feel like when we're talking, we're so far in the deep end, we got to understand how to go back to where we were to help like create a dialogue that makes sense for who we're speaking to. You know what I mean? And that's why the podcast is great, because you can continue to bring different human beings that are at different stages. We had a great podcast about spirituality, and that was a great example of like the different stages that we were all at. Right. Like we brought our producer on, Chris, who talked about where he was at in his journey. And to me, it was like looking at a mirror of myself 10 years ago. You know what I mean? And it was like the way he was talking, I was like, oh, damn, like that was literally me, and just always understanding that we're all on a journey. And if 10 people come into a room, honoring every single journey individually and letting them leave with whatever they want. We're not in a converting business. We're not here to convert you. We're not here to, we're not here to sell you on a way of living and a lifestyle. We're here to offer perspective. We're here to offer engaging stories that you might be able to take and resonate with and align with. And hopefully those small breakthroughs help you see life a different way. And some of these bigger problems will just kind of subside as a result. But I think that patience and empathy in this space is definitely going to be critical in terms of combating that resistance and in terms of combating that pushback, because we already know that what we're saying sometimes ain't sexy, and it's not something that people want to talk about on a regular basis, but somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, well, there's always those guys that are, it's always an ego defense, where as soon as they hear something that challenges what they believe, then it's like, oh yeah, whatever. All right, simp, like go have fun on your little podcast. But that's a wounded ego. That's that part of our, our masculinity, where we're afraid that it could be taken away by, at any moment, where it's like, oh, society no longer views us as a man because we did one wrong thing, and we stepped out of line, and now all of a sudden our life is over. We can't hang out with the same people. I lost all my respect, and everybody's making fun of me behind my back. That's that fear that is pounded into us from day one. And there's an author, Mark Green, that spoke about this very, very much. Like the man box culture, if you guys are familiar with that term. It's the man box is basically that small box of accepted behaviors that men are allowed to show in public. Anything outside of that is, very aggressively policed, and you're kind of beaten back into shape. Like, hey, men don't do that. Men don't cry. Men don't talk about feelings. It's like you're only allowed to exist in this little box. It's the man box, and it's super harmful, because not only does it really negatively condition us as men, but everybody else around us, especially, you know, women and girls see that, you know, and they internalize that stuff as well. And they think, oh, well, it's almost like a culture where anything feminine is viewed as less than, you know, where they don't cry. They only, what are you, a girl? As if like it's bad to be a girl, you know,
Right.
and it's that stupid little thing that we internalize without even thinking about it our entire lives. And like you said, that's generations and generations of conditioning that we're slowly trying to work to fix and update, essentially, which is the way I like to look at it. You know, I don't think it's not so much that we're changing what it is to be a man. We're just updating it. Hey, it's an upgrade. Hey, this is, you know, this is Windows XP now. We moved on from Windows 98. You know what I mean? Like we're fixing the things that were wrong, that don't work anymore. You know, we don't use fax machines anymore because we have all this stuff. You know, we're leaving that stuff in the past. And there's a lot of guys that are just, like we said, resistant, and they, you know, they attack almost. As soon as they hear something that challenges them, they attack. It's like, well, something's wrong with you, not me. And it's one of the things that I've experienced the most pushback with is the term toxic masculinity. You know, and listen, it's one of those things where it's like it's a branding issue, essentially. Like people saying, oh, well, masculinity isn't toxic. You're saying it's toxic just being masculine. So on its face, I get it. Like the term doesn't make sense, but these people are papering over what it really means, like what that term is getting at. It's like there's behaviors that are traditionally exhibited by men that are toxic, and they're very common. So it's not that being a man is toxic. There's a lot of men that, you know, exhibit toxic behavior, and that is, it's just so many people just like, it's like people arguing in bad faith, you know, like, you know what we mean, dude. Like, stop giving me a hard time about this and just talk, you know. Like, there's a lot of guys who just, it's just fingers in the air, nah, nah, nah. And that gets really, it's like you're holding everybody back, not just yourself. Like you're taking up oxygen in this conversation, in this space. Like, well, we could be talking about something productive, and now we have to argue semantics about whether, you know, this term makes sense.
Oh, let's spare me with the semantics, man. Like, there's so many, like, so being someone who wants to have deeper conversations sometimes, like what I realize is that, like, when you meet somebody not at their level, right? Like, you're in a deep space and they're in a surface level space, the conversation becomes about semantics, like this word versus that word, that placement versus this placement. I'm like, you know, the feeling that we're talking about here, you know, the conversation we're trying to have, but you're so caught up on a word. And like, one thing that, you know, I'll tip my hat to Kyle on this is like, we actively try to change language, right? Like on our podcast, when it was our turn to talk about toxic masculinity, the first thing that we did is we replaced the word. We said, listen, we're going to talk about toxic masculinity, but to get out of this semantic conversation, we're going to change it to unhealthy expressions of masculinity, right? Because that's what it is, right? It's you expressing your masculinity in an unhealthy way that could lead to a toxic outcome. But, you know, what happens is this, like, you know, we live in a world of cancel culture where like everyone's got a paintbrush and they're ready, you know, I'm ready to slice you up with whatever. And, you know, the toxic masculinity paintbrush has been actively out, you know, and a lot of behaviors, things that are even like, they just scratch the surface of like unhealthy masculine behavior. You're getting painted with a toxic brush. And now, you know, someone who maybe approached a girl at a bar with a little bit, maybe he could have went about it a better way, is getting thrown in the exact same camp as someone who is like verbally abused somebody and like sexually assaulted somebody. I'm like, how are we the same person? Like, maybe I could have used a better blueprint to approach this girl and talk to her, but I just wanted a conversation. I just wanted to get to know her. And I saw 30 other dudes do it this way. So that was the route I went. How am I brushed with the same brush as, you know, verbal abuse? And it can't be one brush. It can't be one size fits all. And I think that it dishonors and so many people are so worried about being in one camp versus the other that now they're not actually like working on the work, which is like just finding the better way, be a human and be in someone else's shoes. You think somebody wants you to go up behind them and grab them before they even know you? Do you think that is how you would want to be approached? Okay. I know that you're only going in for a conversation, but is that how that person wants to be greeted first time around? Maybe not. You know what I mean? Maybe that move worked out once upon a time, but now you know better. And you know that women fear that behavior. They don't like when someone who's overpowering and stronger than them is behind them and is trying to, you know, smooth talk them, but they're in a vice grip. Like, because I don't feel safe, right? Even though I know you.
one of the best ways I've heard to put this is like a comedian said it. He says the general rule of thumb in talking to women is don't say anything to a woman that you wouldn't want another man saying to you in prison. That's honestly, in my opinion, that's right there. There you go. Solves the whole thing.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then there's so much resistance. Like, here's the craziest thing, right? Like, we're talking about this right now, right? It's open dialogue. You've kind of figured it out. Kyle, I know, figured it out. We're having this conversation. Like, okay, cool. Like, why don't we go to people and find better words? Like, now I got to like maybe admit that, hey, I think you're good looking and I think you're attractive. And I gotta own something a little bit more harder for me to do to engage in this conversation with this person versus using my physical presence, which is an easy dominance thing that you can do. Leveraging masculinity, right? Like, I'm just going to leverage dominance. We're having this conversation. It's going well. These same people are the ones that have so easily adopted Bitcoin from like fiat currency, which is like mentally so hard to grasp, but we can't grasp that, hey, going up behind somebody and grabbing them is probably not the best route of a relationship or a conversation. And you're having this semantic conversation, you know? I'm getting passionate now because I'm showcasing sometimes how frustrating it can be to talk to someone who I'm like, I see how you behave in other areas of life. If it's a business endeavor or if it's like adopting some sort of currency, like we've been able to, as men, figure out so many other crazy, outlandish things, right? And it's energy and effort.
Third time's a charm. Sorry.
Bless you.
Bless you.
And it's those are the times in the conversation where, me and Kyle, what we do is we try to like, I love this elevator analogy I've created in my mind a lot of times where it's like when the elevator doors are open and you go in, you're calm, you close them. What happens in the elevator is not public knowledge, right? And that's what me and Kyle in meetings are like. Like we show the passion, we show the frustration, but then when the elevator doors open, we're calm, cool, and collective. And now we want to have a conversation that serves, right? Because we know that bad energy doesn't just fix bad energy. You know what I mean? So for us, it's like, even though we're frustrated about this, we understand how can I convince somebody like, hey, if you've been able to figure out Bitcoin some weird way, how have we not been able to figure out this? But how can you have that conversation where it's inviting, it's not like challenging, because we know we're capable, we're just not willing. So how can we create more willingness? Is like, these are just challenges of being in the men's space and being in a very resistant environment. But the
Bitcoin thing, that's almost like that's like the age-old dichotomy. It's like, is it numbers or emotions? Like the Bitcoin is, how do you figure out the numbers, the equations that go along with this? How does this make sense? It's dollars and cents. Whereas the other stuff, like you have to turn on your emotions, and a lot of guys, they haven't worked that muscle. So it's much easier to do one thing because this is logic. It's just pure logic. I can figure this out. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, done. The other thing, you have to understand, you have to have emotional intelligence, which is a term that I love because it's something that's lacking in a lot of us. We've never been taught this. It hasn't been something that's been part of the curriculum for us, essentially. Whereas with women, it's much different. From the time they're young and socialized, it's a very different way. They're not limited in the way we are, whereas like the man box, as boys, you can only do these things. Whereas women, they could do pretty much whatever, It's the same reason why if there's guys who see, they go out with their girlfriend and the girlfriend gets drunk and kisses another girl. It's like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. But if a guy and his girlfriend went out and the guy got drunk and kissed another guy, that girlfriend is not cheering. You know what I mean? Now, I'm not saying this is something that I do. I'm saying that this is, I'm examining. Like, look, there's two sides to this, and it's not just men that take part in it. A lot of women, unwittingly perpetuate that same man box culture.
And you talked about something great there that I like that actually adds to the semantics conversation is that, sometimes as men, we are very logical thinkers. We think very rationally. We think very logically. So when you bring in a conversation that involves a lot more emotion, they're just going to see the pillars and try to like move the logic around, right? And if you're trying to if I'm speaking at the emotion, you're speaking at the logic, well, it's really hard to actually get a conversation that goes anywhere, right?
Yeah, it's two parallel lines. They're never going to meet.
Exactly. I either got to get to your street or you got to get to my street, and we got to figure out how to have that conversation. And so for us, it's like, how do you get more of the emotion in there? Or how do you speak into their language? How do you make emotions mathematical or more logical or more, you know what I mean? How do you take experiences that they know that they've had and things like that? And so So yeah, I think that there's definitely I don't think emotional intelligence is natural for everybody. I think that definitely, like, you know, your environment creates that. And that's something that me and Kyle, I think, you know, we've had for a long time. Just, you know, I don't think it was always perfect. I don't think we always knew what the emotions meant. But one thing I've always said is I never struggled feeling emotions. I struggled expressing them. Right. So I think that there's always two there's people I look at and I'm like, I don't think this person actually feels emotions. Like they've embodied the like suppressed, numb, like, you know, and they're just moving through life. And so typically that person looks like the person who, the energy of it feels like there's very little consequences to their actions, you know, very, very empty in terms of kind of like, I can do this. And you're not very emotionally attached to any of your decisions. You just kind of live life and boom, 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 boom. There's that. And then there's the person who like deep down inside, they like something comes up and they're like, that don't feel good to me, but I don't know how to, it's like, I feel it, but I don't. And I've been in that camp, right? I've always known, I'm like, ooh, I don't feel that. It doesn't feel good to me. But I was like, but I don't think this environment allows me, I can't say what I want to say. So I would look around and be like, nope, I'm holding that one in. But
this doesn't feel good, and I don't know why, so I'm just going to go punch things until I can figure something out.
Exactly. Turtle and avoid, you know? So I think that when you can address kind of which one you are, you know, and then you start to tackle that, for me, it's been a journey of trying to figure out how to leverage those emotions for good, you know, and trying to find a way to the point where I've shared this on a podcast before, on my basketball as a young, I used to think emotions were bad. So my whole, cause I saw emotions as in sport, if you saw emotion in somebody, you figured out their trigger point, you figured out their weakness, right? It's double down on that. Oh, he doesn't like that. Oh, you reacted to that piece of trash talk worked, or that piece of like, you know, move that I did worked on kind of breaking your mental down. Well, now I'm attacking that the whole entire game.
It's like,
you know
poker,
what I mean?
You got him on tilt.
Got him on tilt. Exactly. And so I wrote on my basketball as a teenager, feel every emotion, show none, you know? And it was my way of protecting myself and being like, hey, dude, I know you're feeling everything, but like, don't let these people see what you feel, because if they see it, they'll poke at it, they'll pick at it, and they'll try to manipulate you, and they'll try to, like, you know, get in your head.
Don't give them that power over you.
Don't give them that power over you. But little did I know that was a very not maybe the vibe that you want to cultivate, because the long-term effects of that, you know, statement, feel every emotion, show none, is it hurts that expression that you were talking about, that pendulum of being able to be a man that lives in that box that only lives from here to here. There's a lot of emotions that exist on this side of the totem pole. And unless you're willing to, you know, entertain those emotions, I feel like you only ever know yourself, you know, part of the way.
Okay. So, you know, to piggyback off that and lead us into the next thing, exactly that is where in basketball, that approach, whereas feel all the emotions and show none, it serves you in the game of basketball.
It does.
But it's outside of it that it becomes a detriment.
Exactly.
So as men, we need to take some of those things that serve us at a certain time and figure out how to kind of compartmentalize, you know, how to switch it on and off. Like sometimes having aggression as a man can be a good thing. It could be a matter of life and death. But if you apply that to other areas of your life, it can be horrible. It could be, you know, like toxic, for lack of a better word. So how do we learn how to switch those things on and off? You know, that's one of the things that I think it can be most helpful if we kind of look at it, you know, from that route. Like, all right, let's go down this road. How can we make this work? Now, that brings me to a quote from someone who's been, you know, very polarizing. And you guys being from Canada, you guys are familiar with Jordan Peterson. So he had that quote. It's like, you know, was it? A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is capable of extreme violence, but has it under voluntary control. I really like that quote because, you know, it's true. Like, you don't have to just be, you know, some little kind of impish little, you know, nebbish little guy, you know, and try to, well, I'm a male feminist and I do this, and it's like, okay, that's fine if that's who you are. But what if you're not? What if you're some big burly guy? Like, you don't have to do that to be a good man. You could still be aggressive and be strong, but you have to know how and when to apply that. And you know, I feel like that message gets lost in people like Jordan Peterson, or there's even guys like, you know, Jocko Willink, where they're more of like the real traditionally masculine side, the tough guy side, whereas people kind of tune out what their overall message is because of a few things that they might disagree with. Like, do you guys find that there's other, polarizing characters? Because obviously on one side there's that, then there's guys like, like the Justin Baldonis on the other side from A Call to Men. Like, there's very different ideologies. Like, is there any speakers out there, public figures that you think, kind of do a good job of representing how you guys feel?
I mean, Kyle, I want you to touch on the gardener quote that you love. Yeah, that kind of resonates with this area.
I love how you guys can kind of toss it back and forth to one another. It's almost like a Q-tip fife dog thing. It's a handing it off. It's call and response. I got to give you credit for that. You guys, we've
gotten really good at knowing what the other person is going to say before they say it, which is great. It's very much an intimate relationship in that context, if you will. We definitely know what we're doing and we are aware. And so what he's speaking to is, I definitely was triggered at first by Jordan Peterson's idea of that we are savages. I think that's the word that he put, is that we're savages. At any point, if we wanted to, whoever was in the room, we could kill. Without worry, we could flip that switch and say everyone's dead. That's something we could do at any point. The difference is that most of us just aren't willing to do that and don't want to do that. So the challenge, though, is that we don't admit that that's a part of our psyche. We don't say, no, I can't do that, or I'm not capable. No, you are. It's just you're not embracing that side of you. And it's not to say you have to, because, no, why would you start to randomly kill people, right? That's not but that's the polarizing concept of what Jordan B. Peterson is saying, is that there is a power that we're not harnessing. There is a power within us that we're not using to our benefit. And so we do just become passive with it. We do become passive with life. And that's one of the challenges in the masculine space, is we're very passive these days. And that's the challenge in relationships as well, which is a whole larger conversation. But the example that Anwar is talking about is, I believe it's a parable, and I don't exactly know where it's from on the top of my head, but the statement goes, it's better to be a warrior in the garden than it is to be a gardener in war. And
I'm familiar with that quote.
Yes. Yeah. And it's very simple, but the idea is exactly what Jordan B. Peterson is saying, is that train yourself, understand your capabilities, see what you can accomplish, actually find those things. That's why so many of the people out there saying, like, how do you start to embrace your masculine energy, is to get into boxing and, getting to fighting. Not to say that you can start fights on the streets. It's not what we're saying, but just understand your capacity, right? There's so much more we're capable of that we're not embodying. And that example is that if war comes and you're not ready for it, that is the challenge. It's not to say war could never come. We can never, not literally like war, like World War III, but war just in our daily lives, right? If we're not training ourselves on how to be prepared for war and know how to control that, then we're hindering ourselves, because then we're just going to be a gardener in war, and that doesn't serve.
Well, that's perfect, because that's the flip side to the other thing with it, expanding who we are and what our potential is it works both ways. Whether you're an aggressive guy naturally and you have to kind of open up the sensitive side of yourself, if you're a sensitive guy, you need to open up the aggressive side. Not use it, walk around fighting people on the street, but understand that that's also a part of you. And it all ties together. It's two sides of the same coin, right? It's being a full human being. Obviously, as biological males, our makeup is a little different than biological females. So there's other sides of us. I don't think that on average, like women have the capacity for aggression that we do. It's just something in our biology. But anyway, it's all the same thing. It's just people don't realize they're talking about the same issue. They're just coming to it from different sides.
Right.
So I really like that.
And in this speaker context, and unfortunately, I can't say that I've found someone who balances both. I think that, I think Jordan B. Peterson does his best, but he definitely does steer on the edge of the savages aspect, which is why it's so polarizing. I think the only context that I've ever found this to make sense for me is when more in the spiritual realm. And the reason that I say that is because the spiritual realm talks all about this in energies. So the masculine and the feminine energy. And for me, I'm incredibly drawn to this because the reframe of it all is balancing the understanding of the idea that we have both traits inside of us and that it's a human nature thing. It's not a gender-based thing. So everyone has masculine and feminine energies, and those are not contextual to a specific gender. So masculine is not specifically male and feminine is not specifically female. However, there are components of now biology that obviously play into that a little bit. The challenge for me with like some of the language, like we said, like I'm huge on language, is that I actually don't believe that aggressive is a trait we should carry. I think it's assertiveness. I think that aggression is, on the language terms, comes across as like you are very overbearing and dominant, and you come across in a way that is not often respectful, where the assertiveness comes from a more grounded and directional space where you know what you're doing, and whether that requires more physical force is irrelevant. It just means that you know the direction you're going, you're decisive, you take action. Those are all components of the masculine energy. And the wounded side of that is the aggressive side, where you feel like it requires aggression to get what you want. And I've come across a lot of that from the man space, is that aggression is used to get what they want. And so what I feel like aggression involves is like overly angry and emotional manipulation and whatever it takes, because instead of just standing firm in who I am, it's like, no, I want X, Y, Z. So I'm going to force you to give me X, Y, Z by being aggressive, whether that is physically or emotionally or verbally. I'll yell at you. I'll scream. I'll do whatever it takes to be like, no. This is what I want. This is what I'm getting, which is another component of the wounded masculine, which is controlling. And then that leads into being abusive and unstable and fearful and lacks respect. There's so much components. So that's really the only space I found where it seems to just make sense, is when I start to get into the energetic side of things, and it just all seems to just fit well. It all just seems to make sense without there needing to be this massive polarity between Justin Baldoni and Jordan B. Peterson. Right? Because there is a huge contextual difference between the two. Justin Baldoni embraces his masculinity, but in a more compassionate and softer, I guess, way, if you want to say in comparison, where Jordan B. Peterson's is like super abrasive and very closed box. And there isn't a lot of willingness to listen because he's right. And there's just a lot of different context between the two. So I think it's very fascinating. So it is unfortunate that I haven't found someone who specifically can speak to all of this in that way.
Well, I like that observation too. I think that is the big problem with Peterson, is that he does come off very abrasive. You know, it's always coming from a place of, I know more than you, you know? And I agree 100% with your distinction between aggression and assertiveness. I think it's a much better way of putting it, because you're right. Aggression does come off kind of sounding a little more negative, you know? So, and
we can still use the language. I think it's just about what society has created around this language, right? We've had so many years of thinking about what the word aggressive means. And now we're at a place where it's like, it's kind of like the idea of toxic, right? It's not necessarily necessary, but it's now the label we've attached to the word that changes everything. Toxic worked for a long time. And now it's like, well, now we're looking at people as if they're terrible people. They're not terrible people. They're just unsure of how to express their emotions and express themselves. So where are we doing? Are we speaking in a progressive way, or are we speaking in a everyone has to be right or wrong? It doesn't have to be that way. We can support progression while still knowing that some of these things aren't really helping us. They're harming us. So again, I'm obsessed with language, so you'll probably recognize that. And you probably heard about it in our other podcasts. I love language, but I don't think it's always necessary. Yeah.
It helps though. It really helps, because some people hear a certain buzzword and they automatically, their ears shut, you know? Then it becomes a defensive thing, like we talked 100%. About before. They hear that certain thing. It's like, well, you said I'm toxic? What am I doing?
Right.
Like I'm taking care of my family, trying to be a good guy, and I'm toxic? And now we just ruin any chance at having some kind of meaningful conversation.
Exactly.
So the language really does matter. And, you know, I think a lot of people need to be much more aware of that, because sometimes like poor messaging really ruins the whole mission, you know? So we're getting close to the end here. The last thing I want to talk about is, you know, you mentioned that, you know, people that are offenders of these things. Who do you find is the more frequent offender of being, you know, a poor idea of a man, you know, exhibiting negative traits, what's the word I'm looking for? Negatively masculine traits. You know what I mean? These unhealthy masculine things. Do you find that it's more the older generation, the guys that are really set in their ways, or do you find it's younger men who just simply haven't learned another way or don't know any better yet? Like, do you find that, you know, whereas there's like the young men who are, you know, the testosterone's flowing through them and they're crazy, you know, or the old men who are just in these calcified ways of thinking. Because for me, I don't know, I feel like the older generations can sometimes be the more harmful to the evolution that I feel like we need to go through. You know, what about with you guys?
Yeah, I think,
and I'm encouraging you to be just a slight bit ageist here, playfully ageist.
I haven't had that happen in a long time. I'm usually a wireless guy, but whoo, you guys remember the wires getting ripped out of your ears when you're in the middle of a set and you got to finish the set?
Oh, you mean like yesterday? I'm well aware. I work in construction and I wear headphones all day, so sometimes like I usually tuck the cord under my shirt.
Yeah.
And if you don't, and you walk by and something gets caught on it, you know, not fun.
Not fun at all. Not fun at all. No, definitely that move. You got to put it in the shirt. To answer the question, I think I agree with you. I side more. I'll add more context. The reason why I think so. I think that just, you know, the older men just have more to unlearn. Mm-hmm. Right. I think that like as they were coming, growing up in the conditioning and things like that, I just think that they have more to unlearn. Therefore, they're probably going to be more offenders. I think if you're younger in today's generation, like it's really not uncommon for me to see a teenager crying on social media. You know what I mean? A male teenager crying on social media because he's been called out for something and now he feels remorseful and he goes on his story and is emotional about it. Just the expression. I just feel like when you the younger generation is getting a whole nother palette of what could be possible. Now they're still being led by the older generation. So they're still being taught, but it almost kind of fits the way I grew up, right? Like where I had my parents at home and I had the external world. So I actually had a lot more power in my decision because I was getting two pieces of information and it was my choice to do what I wanted to do with it. Mm-hmm. Where the older generation, they got one tone, you know, and they had no one to combat that with. So I think that they have more to unlearn. And so for my short answer would be probably I would lean more towards them. I think the younger generations already showed a level of empathy that, you know, surpasses, you know, what we know to be. I think the average young child, a 13-year-old, 12-year-old, they're more in tune with their emotions. I feel like they do tell you, you know, they could tell you what's going on and they're a little bit more open. And they've heard the rumors of, you know, men don't cry is not a thing anymore and man up is not a thing anymore. So, you know, and not only are they hearing this, they're hearing it in bunches, right? We're in a world of like so much information. So they're not even hearing it from one source or from that one kid at school. Like they're hearing it from hundreds of people all day, every day.
Everybody's drinking out of a fire hose of information.
Literally, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, there's really no reason for you to, other than the fact that, you know, same way I had to decipher, you know, what I was being taught at home from when I was like, you're still learning those things, but like you can't pretend like as if you don't know any other information. Like you do know other information. You're making choices now, you know, and I think that the younger generation, their biggest challenge is going to be, and I often talk about this, and, you know, maybe you could speak to it because you're a parent and, you know, you're going to have to navigate some of these waters too, is that like, how do we teach kids how to drink out of this fire hose? Right? Like that's really the challenge we're facing now is where before I felt like our parents were trying to find us fire hoses to like find information. Like it was a seek for information. It was like, there's this library, good luck. It's a tedious task. That's the way you can get information, or newspapers. And it wasn't as like, it was more so like who had the discipline enough to go do the work and find where all the information was. And those people got ahead, right? The people who were like, I will bear the challenges of like finding this lack of information. I'll do everything I got to do to get the information. And then they got really far ahead. We're not raising a generation that's looking for information. We're raising a generation that needs to be able to be decisive and understand fake news versus real news. How do you digest and how do you slow down and breathe when this fire hydrant is like, you know, you're just drinking. So how do you slow down and breathe and how do you, you know, analyze what you're, so it's a completely different set of challenges. And I think the ingrained conditioning of, you know, the older generation, what they've had to go through, and more empathetically, me and Kyle talked about this in our next couple of podcasts where we talked about coming up, we got a couple of podcasts talking about death, regret, and some of these kind of concepts. And we had a moment in the podcast where we were like, imagine finding out that you're like 75 now and realizing that like showing your emotions were cool. Yeah. It was fine, but you're 75 now, right? Like, in some weird capacity, like I hope that I wish people understood that, like, do you know how much of an advantage it is to be learning what we're learning right now? while
100%.
while the life is still ahead of us. Like there was a generation that the conversation we're having now was not had. They couldn't have it, and now they're 80, and
Now it's too late.
there's not even any room for like we're talking about unlearning conditioning. Well, you need space to unlearn. You need the time to unlearn to be able to, reap the fruits of your labor. And so I hope just people understand the blessing that it is to be able to be in a world we live in now, where it's we're encouraged to find that expression.
Definitely.
And so I think the younger generation's definitely way ahead.
What do you think, Kyle?
I think I agree. I think that the younger generation is ahead in some capacity. I do think that I can't imagine being a young generation child right now. I think that in the age range of, I don't know, there's not really a specification behind this, but I'm just going to ballpark it at, let's say like 27 to 35. If you're in that age range right now, I think you're the most advantageous age range available to us, because we grew up with a massive boomer phase. We also did not grow up with any social media. We didn't grow up with any kind of really technology. We were at the forefront of it. And so we got to see all of that progress and be a part of that growth. And then now also being a part of the complete difference in the way other children are being brought up. Like we had this opportunity where we get to take advantage of all the social and all of the information. But before that, we also got to take advantage of time outside and playfulness and enjoyment for the weather and all those things. So I find that if there's most advantageous space, it's us in this age range, in this middle ground, because we got to see both sides. So we get to be the bridge. We get to be the bridge between what was and what is now and what is coming, and decipher what is maybe even the better decision. Because like I said, we got to see all of the things that life was before what life is now. So we get to find that balance. We had to create that balance. As far as who's more expressive of that, I think the older generation, only because of the generational trauma that they're navigating. The older generation, the baby boomers, they're navigating so much different parental upbringing challenges and societal conditioning that we haven't faced fully in the age range we're in. They're facing completely different battles. And it was never an idea or even a thought to be like, should I start to work through that? Because their parents didn't, and their grandparents didn't. No one's working through that at that time. So they are struggling, I would say, probably the most. But then at the same time, I don't want to discredit the younger generation now, because they grow up and as soon as they're born, they're like, here's this device and, pick your gender and, colors don't matter. And, they're coming through a completely different idea and space. So, I have experiences in my life where that lack of understanding, or not even lack of understanding, the struggle is a current struggle. I know, and I see it at the forefront of my life right now. And I can't imagine what that would be like. So, that's that births creation of simp, right? Like simp wasn't created by us. However, there was a word for that when we were younger. I can't remember what it was, but
Sucker.
There was a simp.
You're a sucker.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like it's just the word has just evolved into like trying to not say what it did, but still say what it did. So are we progressing? Is there anyone that's expressing it any worse? Yes and no. I think it's a very detailed observation, but when simp came out, that really got me. I thought we were really past that. And we aren't yet. And that's a big language. I work with a youth group and they're 13 to 21. When we gave them the space to talk amongst themselves, they were talking about being a simp. And I just was so astonished that this is still a thing with the way that the world is working now. I just didn't realize it was still happening. So it was very eye-opening. So for me, I have a little bit of context inside both spaces. And I actually think, now that I'm speaking it out loud, I think they're both equally struggling with expressing their masculine.
Yeah, I think for sure, I think you guys both hit it on the head, is that our generation, I'm 36. I'm not sure. How old are you guys?
I just turned 30.
I'm 29.
Okay. But around this, the millennials, essentially, we, like you said, we grew up without the internet, without social media. We know the old way. That was what we were born into. And we evolved with the new way, with the internet. We know how to navigate our way through it because, we were there from the beginning. Whereas the older generation doesn't, because they showed up late and then they ruined it, of course. And then the younger generation, they're born into it. It's already flourished into this massive thing. And for us, we, like you said, we're that bridge. Whereas I know this is true for me and for a lot of people in our age range. A lot of us were latchkey kids. Both of our parents worked. They were, caught up doing their careers and trying to build a good life and, playing in the stock market or what have you. And we were kind of left to figure a lot of things out on our own, which was the old way. But at the same time, we also realized that they're like, as parents, like they weren't really there, like available emotionally a lot of the time, or maybe they, like you said, they didn't have the tools to figure out what was, ailing them emotionally inside. That generational trauma that you mentioned, like they didn't know how to fix it. They weren't having these conversations. They were still operating under the old way. So now with the proliferation of the internet and, there's just these fire hoses of information, we're all trying to work our way through them. We know how to, our parents didn't. And we're trying to now raise a new generation based off, with the knowledge that we have. So we're trying to correct those mistakes and prepare these kids for a new world that's changing so fast that sometimes we don't even understand it, And, obviously being young and having the hormones running through you, making you crazy is tough, especially when you find out that, you make one mistake and next thing you know, there's a Twitter mob coming for you. That's a scary place to live. You hear this all the time. Thank God we didn't have that when we were young, All the mistakes we made can die with the past. Whereas now that stuff lives on forever. And that's a scary place to be. Mm-hmm. So, I don't really know where I'm going with this. Basically, I think it's the older generation's fault. A lot of times they were too wrapped up in themselves. Now you have generations that saw that and they try to correct it and be helicopter parents, which is also a bad thing. Whereas you're not giving your kids space to be independent and grow and learn. Mm-hmm. And I could probably talk about this for no less than 6 or 7 hours. So I'm going to cut myself off a little. But yeah, I think that it's... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I did want to add, as you were talking there, something kind of, profound kind of came up for me. And just like when you're talking about, the worst offender, right? Like who the worst offender is. And Kyle kind of touches on like how it's pretty equal in terms of kind of suffering, right? Like it's kind of, they're both kind of struggling to express. I think what we had that I think the younger generation doesn't have as much as there was more room for us to fail forward. I felt like, I think the older generation got to actually fail forward. Like they could just like make mistakes and like, they weren't so worried about the Joneses. Like they could just be a little bit more free. And that came with a lot of like, not very well thought out sometimes ideas. And like, they kind of just like threw things at the wall, saw what stick and ran with it. I think the younger generation, they're limited in their ability to just fail forward because they're so worried about scrutiny and criticism. But the scrutiny and criticism has allowed them to think a lot more deeper about what they want to fail forward for. So there's a level of like responsibility and accountability for their actions that, they may not want to go and, be put in a worse offender camp or cancel culture. So they'll think their ideas a lot more through before executing on them because they're like conscious about like, repercussions and things like that. So, but you can go down a rabbit hole of being too protective within even our own space, right? Like
definitely.
If you're too scared of cancel culture, like, do you even have a man's podcast? Do you even go talk about anything? So you have to have some sort of willingness to be like, okay, if I do say something that doesn't land or whatever, am I willing to rephrase what I said to, make it land better? Am I willing to learn that, hey, what I said was wrong and I'm willing to apologize and own it? Or C, am I willing to double down on what I said? You know what I mean? Because I believe it wholeheartedly. And if you can, accept those three options versus being like, I'm not going to talk about it at all because I don't want to get canceled. That's the challenges of the young people, I think, is that the worry of ruining your reputation globally is a daunting thing to have to like, it almost puts the pressure of being perfect, where I felt like the older generation could just kind of do what they wanted to do and fail at a different rate, which was irresponsible at times. Yeah.
Charlemagne the God. He has a great quote where he always says, today's generation would never allow Malcolm Little to become Malcolm X. It's like, if you consider his story where he came from, like they would never be able to look past that and let him become, the great speaker that he ended up becoming. It's like nobody's perfect. And I really do feel like the conversation is changing, every day. It's in terms of people are getting tired of the whole cancel culture thing. And it's become more of like a boogeyman at this point, whereas the average person doesn't even agree with it, but we're still talking about it as if it's just some big looming presence, and I really do feel like it's starting to shift back into a more rational place. So before we just keep going down any more rabbit holes, which I know we could, I want to say I really enjoyed talking to you guys. Like, I think you guys have some really, really, really good, really interesting and profound ideas about some of this stuff. And I would like to do it again in the future if you guys are down for it. But I do want to say thank you very much for being so generous with your time and coming on the show. And hopefully, the audience is getting as much out of this as I know I am. So thank you, gentlemen.
Man, thanks for having us.
It's my pleasure. So before we get out of here, do you guys want to plug anything? You want to plug the show? Any projects you got coming up?
Yeah, well, we can obviously share. Obviously, we run a podcast for men called Modern Masculinity. The C is a K to represent the masks that we wear as men, and hopefully we're removing those and opening up ourselves to our actual authenticity. We are hoping in the future to create a larger community of what we call conscious kings. So getting into the space of being there for each other as often as possible, that's only going to progress. There's going to be a lot more things coming in the future. We really only have just started. We are 22 episodes deep. We have many more to come. This is a long-term goal. It will turn into a YouTube. It will turn into men's groups. It will turn into everything that it needs to in the future. Merch, everything is on its way. So there's a lot of beautiful things that are coming for us. And so you can follow us on our socials pretty much anywhere at Modern Masculinity. We are more predominantly, though, on Instagram right now.
Okay. Anwar, are you good with all that?
Yeah, I'm great with all that. And, our podcast is sponsored by a men's mental health app. So Tether is the app. If anyone, wants to join a community right now and wants to join, a peer-enabled space where you can kind of talk about, anything that you're struggling with, things like that. The platform has different, podcast applications, different blogs. It's just a platform where men can kind of go and comment and talk about things. And you can read how forums are going. If, you're struggling with your own friend circle and your own group and you're not finding, what you need right now to kind of, help you get through some of the challenges, that's a great place to start, and they sponsor our podcast. So I'd like to share that as well. Tether is TETHR.
Perfect. I'll put the link right above your picture here.
Perfect.
So, all right, guys, thanks again. I appreciate it. That's it. That was the conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please make sure you go check out the show. Very, very interesting stuff. Very intelligent stuff. And yeah, show them some love. Show them some gratitude for taking the time to talk to my bald head. I was going to say ass and head, bald head. That's weird. And if you notice I'm a little stuffy, everybody in the house is sick, including the baby. It's not good. It's not good. But it's better off we're doing this on Zoom. And don't worry, it's not COVID, by the way. We already had that. Yeah, that's it, guys. You know where to find the show. We're A Pot Amongst Men on Instagram and Twitter, apotamongstmen@gmail.com for any long-form questions or comments. You know where to find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, Stitcher. Oh, and YouTube also. I mean, if you're watching this, then you already know. But if you're listening, you can watch this whole thing on YouTube. Just search A Pot Amongst Men, and there we are. There we are, just like that. It's magic. Magic of technology. That's it, guys. I'll see you next week. Peace.